Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, which is the second in our June series on regulation in the context of COVID-19. Today's webinar is on the topic of rethinking regulatory priorities, and I will introduce shortly our panel of three discussants who are going to make some short opening remarks, and then we're going to have hopefully a conversation on that topic. What I'll do to begin with is just set the scene, perhaps with some opening remarks of my own. What we're looking at this morning is the question of reimposing or reintroducing or rethinking priorities from before the crisis. Perhaps look at whether there's a need for a transition. Is a transition possible? What will it look like in a world of regulation within the COVID-19 context? A key, and for some, certainly the main priority for many regulators prior to COVID was tackling the climate emergency. And I'm just going to hopefully share my screen and show you a quote, which is from last month, and no less than 8 regulators in France: the Competition Authority, the Data Protection and Privacy Watchdog, the Telecom Regulator, the Financial Markets Authority, the Transport Regulator, the Energy Regulator, the Audiovisual Regulator, and the IP Authority, all published a joint working paper examining their climate emergency priorities in light of the crisis. And you hopefully can see what they had to say about that. The interesting thing, in some senses, there is it was a conversation really among the regulators as opposed to with other stakeholders, but it was a pretty united front in terms of their view of the wider context of the climate emergency, and also the lasting economic change that had been affected by the crisis. The obvious point, in a sense, is that regulators are not only mandated to look at environmental change. There are those with competition and or consumer mandates, and they've all had to, during the crisis, as we discussed last week, had to accommodate various COVID-related interventions which restrict or distort competition, whether that's in the form of price regulation, financial support, relaxation to conduct of business rules, and bearing in mind the longer-term changes to the economy, the disruption of international supply chains, the disruption to the economy, worsening inequality, social exclusion coming from the crisis, and which we may not fully understand at the moment. A key question for regulators, I think, is to consider how and indeed whether all those interventions need to be unwound so as to restore the status quo, or they should be reasserting their previous policies and policy priorities. In parallel, regulated firms are having to manage the expectations of key investors as regards their commitment to global environmental, social and governance standards. Many of those investors, such as pension schemes, have regulatory obligations of their own, requiring them to demonstrate in turn their own commitment to those standards. And I guess how flexible is the question, should those international standards now be in the face of the COVID crisis, bearing in mind the differential impact of the crisis across different sectors and jurisdictions. Anyway, those are just some preliminary thoughts from me. What I'd like to do now is to introduce and to get some introductory comments from our three speakers. I'll turn first to Nick Fincham. Nick, over the past 30 years, has held senior positions in water, wastewater, airports, air traffic control, mail, gas and power sectors in both the public and private sectors. Most recently, Nick was Executive Director at Thames Water, and prior to that he worked at the UK's Civil Aviation Authority, where he led teams responsible for all aspects of economic regulation of UK airports and air traffic control. I was interested to see that he's as old as me, or certainly old enough to remember Off-Gas and Offer, where he was, Off-Gas and Offer being the predecessor to the energy regulator of Ofgem. So, Nick, if I could hand over to you for your initial remarks. You're on mute.
Certainly, Gordon.
That's you.
I think I've unmuted.
You're unmuted now, yeah.
Is that any better?
Perfect.
Yeah, you can hear me now. Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks, Gordon, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to sort of have a go at making some remarks about what the implications are of COVID-19 for rethinking regulatory priorities. But I'm told I've got sort of around about 5 minutes to do that, and it's obviously an enormous topic, and we are at the moment really in the foothills. We don't know yet what the full implications are of what we're living through. In some ways, that can mean, there can be things that we haven't yet understood the magnitude of. In other senses, I think we might, because we're in the middle of this crisis, we might risk overstating the implications of what's going on. And so I want to just make a few remarks about a little bit about water, a little bit about aviation, and then perhaps a comment about general public policy making. The first thing to say on water, and I'm talking about the UK water industry, which is a very tightly regulated sector, is that I think, and I've actually been saying for some time, there is probably a need for a reset or a slight sort of flex in the direction of regulation. In many ways, Ofwat's got a lot right over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, in that what it's been doing is restructuring the balance of incentives on water companies away from rewarding efficient financing structures, which obviously created a strong incentive for companies and investors to invest through debt finance, increase gearing, and take advantage of the difference between the returns and the very low cost of debt, and to rebalance that so that more money is attached to service performance, which is clearly a sensible thing, a sensible bit of rebalancing that Ofwat did. Tick. But I think one of the issues that is still out there, and it's been out there for some time, is that the way in which water companies are regulated in the UK still drives them to perform in the relatively short term. All the money flows from actions, whether that's reducing costs or performing in the next 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 years of the price control. And what that does, because those economic incentives are so incredibly powerful, what that does is it detracts from the effort, management effort, shareholder effort, on ensuring that the companies have got the capability in terms of the human capital, the assets, and the balance sheets required for long-term, sustainable, efficient performance. And so, I think that's something that the regulator really, and the CMA will be looking at it with the appeals that are going on at the moment. That's something that I think needs to be looked at. I think, it's only my opinion, that COVID-19, in a sense, accelerates that debate and actually emphasizes its importance. Because what we've found, I think, in the general public perception of what's happened, is that instead of valuing people because they're skilled, and dare I say it, there's a lot of people on this call this morning who are very skilled. We've always been taught in economics lessons to distinguish between skilled and unskilled workers. What I think we're realizing is actually there's a difference between skilled and unskilled, and important and unimportant, or essential and not really essential. And I'm afraid a lot of us fall into the not essential category. So sorry to break that to you sort of so early in the day. But I think what that means is then, the implication, the basic economics is that we as a society really value a safe and reliable water supply. So let's just be careful about constantly putting the pressure to drive down, minimize costs in the short term, because actually the value of the thing, this essential service, and it's is probably a lot higher than the price that companies charge for that. And I think customers generally, and through the research, back that up. But other people have an opinion about that. One really sort of relatively minor issue that's come up through COVID is the impact on the non-household retail market, which some people may be interested in. I think what that's shown is that it's really important where a market operates that there are effective and robust mechanisms for companies to exit the market, and that there's effective resolution mechanisms. And that's obviously a lesson we all learned in a big way through the global financial crisis, but in a very, very small way it applies in the water non-household retail market. That's probably all I'll say on water. On aviation, I think well, actually, just one more point on water, which is this point about resilience. A lot of people talk about resilience. What I'm really saying about the need to rebalance incentives in water is about trying to improve the resilience of water companies in the long term. So just, I mean, lest I miss that word out, I think just worth sort of making that point. Aviation's obviously been hugely hit by the crisis. Very, very hard by the pandemic, by government responses to the pandemic, by people's choice, I suspect, increasingly. And I think it's obviously too early for anybody really to predict how that's going to play out. It'll obviously depend on the government policy response. I think for transport generally, there's going to have to be, as far as I can see, and I'm not necessarily an operational expert in these areas, but a way of changing the social distancing rules to permit sufficient people to travel on trains and planes to make them economically viable. And that means, reducing the 2 meter rule. It means putting in something, the mandatory wearing of masks clearly is part of what's going on here. And that's all being hotly debated at the moment. Will there be a complete recovery? I think remains to be seen. And one can imagine that people have learned quite a lot through this crisis. We've all learned how to do meetings like this. There's, none of us like commuting anyway, and it may be that we don't need to do quite so much of it, and maybe we don't need quite so much office space, etc., etc. So all of those things may change the pattern of demand, and obviously questions on the big infrastructure investments like the third runway will go hand in hand with that. Well, it may be worth coming back to infrastructure, or maybe talk about that a little bit later. For me, on aviation regulatory priorities, I think what the crisis brings out is that we can continue to muddle through with regulators making forecasts of traffic in the setting of price controls for the air traffic controller NATS or for Heathrow. But actually, you've got to put in quite a lot of reopeners. You're going to have to be aware that you're going to have to reset periodically. There's a lot more risk going on here than the RPI minus X model can bear. And I think it might be a good time actually to review whether there are other mechanisms for dealing with the market power or the pricing power that airports, for example, might have. My mind goes back to some of the ideas actually that Michael Beasley, after whom is a lecture series named, some of you may remember him. His contention on airports was you shouldn't price cap airports. You should let them charge at them, whatever they thought they could charge, but then make sure they provide the output, of course, but then sort of tax the rents that come from that. And that might be a better way of regulating airports. One last point, and that's on just public policy making generally, which I think we might have hopefully learned a little bit about during the course of the last few months. I think I think of good reason, for good reason, a lot of the public policies introduced at the beginning of this pandemic were very blunt in their nature. We didn't collectively know what we were dealing with, and I think reasonable people might agree that urgent action was required, and it wasn't all as one might have wanted. But I think as we learn more and as we understand more, and this really comes into sharp focus in the unlocking process, which is going to be much more challenging, as we know, than the original lockdown. It's really important that public policy is thought about in a having regard to the better regulation principles. So one of the things that I was looking back at is the 5 principles that we used to talk about quite a lot, that regulation should be proportionate, accountable, consistent, targeted, and transparent. And I think the key one for me in that is targeted, because one of the things I think we've learned in the last few months is that this COVID-19 is well, across the population, people have a very different propensity to infect others, depending on the way they live their lives and how much social interaction they have. And that also across the population, we know that people have a very different risk profile if they get it. And, you know, that depends obviously on age, on underlying health conditions. And, you know, I'm no medic, but we can all sort of see these things. But what that brings out is the importance of a more nuanced, targeted policy, which may well allow for the protection of the most vulnerable with the minimum of disruption to the economy, and allow us to get back on our feet, get up and running as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Just finding my mic. So that's fascinating, and thank you very much, Nick, for that. Lots of points for us to come back to if we can. I'd like to move on to our second presenter this morning, Jennifer O'Neill from Aon. Unfortunately, Jennifer's camera isn't working, but she's definitely here. I know that. Jennifer is a senior member of Aon's responsible investment team, where she has responsibility for client education and solution delivery, along with thought leadership. As a senior consultant within Aon's UK investment consulting practice, she has responsibility for providing strategic advice to a number of UK institutional investors, ranging from 300 million up to 8 billion. I was interested to see that prior to beginning her investment career, Jennifer graduated with a master's degree in European politics from the University of Glasgow, where she focused on the macroeconomy of the European Union throughout the global financial crisis. So perhaps some lessons to apply to the current crisis. Anywho, Jennifer, if I could hand over to you for your contribution.
Thanks very much, Gordon, and good morning, everybody. I do promise I am appropriately made up for today, despite the fact that my camera isn't working, so you don't have the benefit of seeing my face. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the themes around regulation across the European Union as we go through today's conversation. So delighted to be able to play a part in the discussion that we're having today. Taking a step back for a second, we can't talk about resilience in the context of the pandemic without talking about resilience to other major risks. I'm sure all of you on the call will have heard a couple of key phrases a number of times over the past few months, notably build back better and choosing the future we want. So regulatory priorities and adaptation are fundamental to that. Hard as it might be, if we go back to pre-COVID-19 times, and if we look back at the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Risk Report, one of the top 10 risks identified was that of infectious disease. That's a harbinger of our current situation. And we can clearly see, therefore, that the risk of the pandemic was not only recognised, but anticipated. But it's also abundantly clear that despite that being the case, many states were underprepared and under-resourced to deal with that. And that's also the case in the risk of climate action failure. And in fact, that is the #1 risk identified by the World Economic Forum. Each year within Aon, we release analysis on the impact of catastrophes and weather events. And over the decades since 2010, that's the costliest on record for global natural disasters, at just shy of $3 trillion, I believe. And we're seeing both the incidence and the severity of natural disasters increasing. So what does that mean for the regulatory environment and the framework that we operate in? Well, the UK's Prudential Regulatory Authority is now requiring banks and insurers to stress test their balance sheets against climate change scenarios. And looking ahead a couple of years, all listed companies and large asset owners in the UK will have to prepare disclosures in line with the global framework, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That's by 2022. So we can see that that's climbing up the corporate agenda. I think it comes back to our central question for today, which is around regulatory priorities and resilience. The question being, can we afford to deprioritise the response to climate resilience in the wake of COVID-19? And just in thinking about that, I want to focus for a moment on how regulators have been influencing the status quo. Historically, the bulk of regulation on matters of environmental, social, corporate governance issues, that's been focused on issuers of debt and equity capital. And in fact, over time, through to the end of 2018, that regulation focused on issuers has outnumbered regulations focused on investors by around 2.5 to 1. And I do want to, if we can, just share a chart with you, if we're able to get that up on screen, that will illustrate the point much better than I'll be able to explain it. So what you can see from the chart that's on screen just now is that regulatory tactics are changing. So in 2018, and again mirrored in 2019, the focus of regulation globally switched very, very clearly and very sharply to those investing in assets, and it's seeking to ask more of investors in their purchase of assets than in the past. This is regulation focused on matters of ESG, so environmental, social, and governance issues. So you can see that the huge spike in the blue bar at the bottom of the chart, and the blue indicates regulation on investors. And that's versus the preponderance of orange bars in previous years, which is regulation on issuers. So we're seeing that trend continuing to increase. And to give you an example of that, Gordon mentioned in his opening remarks that the realm that I operate in is with institutional investors, and a large component of that is corporate pension schemes. Those corporate pension schemes are being asked to demonstrate how they consider climate change risks as long-term asset owners, along with setting out how they engage with issuers of debt or equity instruments on matters connected to ESG risks and indeed opportunities. So that's seeking to make the relationship and the interaction with issuers a lot more active and encouraging that engagement activity. Gordon, if we might be able to see the chart, I'll just go back to some broader themes. In terms of that engagement activity that I've referred to, there's a number of cases in point as to how that looks. If we take Shell, for instance, Shell recently committed, as I'm sure you've seen, to carbon neutrality by 2050. And if you read their statement on that announcement, it's really interesting because it's done jointly with an investor group called Climate Action 100. That group represents hundreds of institutional investors and over $40 trillion of assets. And their focus is on the world's largest emitters of greenhouse gases to engage with them on action on climate change. So they've been doing that with Shell for a number of years. And Shell cited that engagement as being instrumental in their carbon target setting and indeed their commitment to carbon neutrality. So the point of that is really that shareholder engagement is a very powerful tool in incentivizing and encouraging issuers to act on systemic risks and threats. And climate change is one example of that, but investor engagement on net zero target setting is having a tangible impact because investors are acknowledging the risks posed to their own assets and the ramifications of inadequate action. But I'd suggest that action cannot simply be demand-led. The regulatory underpinnings are necessary to develop and enforce and influence a framework for action. If we think about how that may look, one example of that framework development is the European Union's establishment of a taxonomy for sustainable activities. And the intention of that is to help investors understand whether something they're investing in is environmentally sustainable. And just going back to Gordon's reference to my previous academic dalliances, the taxonomy itself is subject to quite a lot of debate, and for example, the respective nation state interests at a political level of France and Germany are quite quite evident and of interest in the ultimate treatment within the taxonomy of nuclear power. Nuclear power generates over 70% of France's power needs, but Germany, of course, following Fukushima in 2011, shut down their nuclear reactor fleet. So the taxonomy isn't immune from external influences, but that being said, it is a great leap forward versus the absence of such a framework. So investors will need to consider how they respond to the taxonomy and how that will influence asset selection and investment choices. But those investment choices are not just driven by classifications of what's sustainable. The underlying economics are fundamental to that, and that's also influenced by policy setting and the regulatory environments that we're operating in. Nick's commented on that as it relates to certain utility markets, for instance. We've seen capital flooding into renewable energy technologies as the economics have become far more favourable over the past decade. Offshore wind and solar, whilst we're still subject to issues of power intermittency and storage, has never been cheaper. And if the UK is to achieve its own targets on carbon neutrality, it has to be a fundamental component of our energy system. It can't be achieved any other way. If any of you have similar interests to my own, I won't ask you to admit it now, but if you've ever looked at how the UK's energy mix changes over time, I must confess I'm quite an anorak. I find that quite fascinating. If we go back just a few years to 2012, it'll show you that at that point, over 40% of the UK's power needs were generated through coal. We barely use coal at all these days. So the concern of investors over stranded assets in fossil fuels is very real. And as we move closer to our targets of 2050, it really isn't all that long away. We will need a far greater focus on how we get there. And that is a question of fundamental economic resilience. And businesses that don't prioritize that will be hurt. Just to sum up, really, the economics of inaction on climate change are absolutely staggering. And businesses cannot afford to deprioritize that in wake of responding to COVID. The way that regulatory priorities are determined and the way that government structures stimulus packages, which, thinking back to the taxonomy and the premise of the taxonomy, those stimulus packages considering and focusing on sustainable activities will really influence how the future looks. And just to go full circle, to go back to the two phrases that I mentioned at the beginning, that will define how building back better looks and what future we choose.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. Again, fascinating contribution there. The final contribution then, before we open up to Q&A, comes from Claire Foster from Shepherd and Wedderburn. Claire is a partner in the firm's banking team and also is the head of clean energy at the firm. She is a very highly regarded practitioner in the project finance market, with a particular focus on power sector projects, particularly in the clean energy arena, as well as infrastructure projects across the UK. So Claire, over to you.
Thanks, Gordon. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Good morning, everybody. I'll preface my observations with the comment that I'm approaching this discussion with my transactional lawyer hat on, and as someone who acts for a number of developers and lenders in the clean energy sector across the UK. So forgive me if my views are a little bit biased in favour of getting the green recovery moving forward at pace. And that's why I think regulation needs to be rethought in terms of priorities. It's not so much a question of whether a transition in regulation is possible, but more that it is an imperative. If I can take you back prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, if you can remember that far back, momentum was gathering apace in relation to ongoing climate emergency narratives, with two key dates most frequently discussed in the UK context. 2050 being the date passed into law by UK government as the target for achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and the Scottish equivalent date of 2045, which was specified in the Climate Change Bill. Incidentally, that date was the most ambitious national target declared to date globally. More locally, to me at least, each of the cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow went a step further and declared a climate emergency within a day of each other, which was last year. Both have indicated that they've brought forward the date for achieving net zero for their respective cities to 2030. So what does that mean? Lots of dates and some grand ambitions, but in practical terms, what does it actually mean? The statistics in the net zero report produced by the Climate Change Committee make for sobering reading. We need a huge increase in renewable energy generation as a result of the proposed decarbonisation/electrification of heat and transport, and the decommissioning of existing installed capacity, which has reached the end of its natural generating life. I guess taking offshore wind as an example, which may set the scene for you, Scotland currently has about 9.8 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity. And the offshore wind sector deal refers to deployment of 30 gigawatts by 2030. That's less than 10 years away. In the CCC report, the figures are even more daunting. They talk about 75 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2050. Just think about that for a moment. The rate of deployment to get even close to those numbers is absolutely staggering. Now, that was the case before COVID reared its head. There was already a mountain to climb, but if nothing else, COVID-19 has brought the need for green recovery into even sharper focus and actually looked at it through a different existential lens. So from a positive perspective, the skies are cleaner, the air fresher, and the water purer. Nature seems to be thriving in cities where it never seemed to before, and no one seems keen to lose those benefits. We need to lock those in going forward. But also worryingly, the pandemic has shone a light on poverty, the fragility of society, inequality, and how life as we knew it is actually unsustainable. And that, combined with us entering the largest recession since wartime, means there's a renewed vigour in approaching a recovery that, as Jennifer mentioned, builds back better and addresses these issues. Now, the recent statistics, and Jennifer will know a lot more about this than I do, have shown that investment in clean energy technologies is outperforming investment in the more carbon-intensive sectors. Investing in clean, green projects is not only good for the economy, but good for the environment. And so the double bottom line of fiscal performance and positive social impact can be achieved for investors. There is plenty of liquidity in the market and plenty of lenders who are keen to support clean energy projects. And in fact, many of their shareholders are now demanding it. In addition, there seems to be a recognition by decision makers that the mistakes that were made after the 2008 financial crisis simply cannot be repeated. There's an imperative not to repeat history by trying to stimulate an economy by piling into carbon-intensive projects. That could set the green agenda back by years. From a regulatory perspective, my concern is that there needs to be more done to help accelerate projects if we are ever to have a chance of meeting the targets. We are literally running out of time, and it must be an imperative that government, regulatory bodies, and the private sector communicate and, more importantly, collaborate to ensure that regulation does not impact on progress, but rather nurtures it. And there's a change in the language now that was never there before. It is about nurturing, it is about societal change, it is about looking after people. My experience is that up until now, there have been significant delays in the clean energy sector. An example is the planning system, where for many projects, the system is slow, it's not fit for purpose, and consequently, not many projects have come forward that should have come forward. And I think there has been a tendency historically to work in silos. I guess the most recent examples are in the last week, where the UK government denied consent for one extension to an offshore wind project and delayed decisions on two others till July. If we've got any hope of achieving these targets, that approach has to change. Now, of course, there's a recognition that protections are required in the sector. I'm not denying that. And they're there for good reason. I'm not advocating a deregulated approach. But what I am asking for is flexibility to ensure that we optimise the regulatory system so that instead of regulation being seen as a set of rules, that going forward it can facilitate incentives and drive innovation and the green recovery. We have an opportunity to do something really transformational. And if I can lob in a hand grenade at the end, that could be even more of an opportunity with Brexit on the horizon. Imagine if the procurement rules could be overhauled. I will stop there, Gordon, to allow a bit more time for questions. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. I wondered if Brexit might make an appearance in the in today's discussion. And see if it keeps coming back. Thank you, Claire, and thanks to all three of you. What I'd like to do is have some discussion. So what I'd do is I'd like to begin just by picking up in a question. I think a theme that's already emerging from what you've said, which is the extent to which we ought to view the impact of COVID-19 on regulatory policy making as an opportunity, perhaps capitalising on changing perceptions among the public, or a threat, perhaps a question around the ability of our existing institutions to cope with the challenges that's been thrown down. So if I can ask each of you to perhaps explore that question, coming first to Nick, if I could.
Yeah, sure, Gordon. I don't know the answer to that, whether it would be regarded as an opportunity or a threat. I suspect what we'll see, and we're already seeing it, is that lots of, lots of partial interests, from whatever angle they're arguing, will seek to use it as an opportunity to say, look, from now on, we need to sort of, change direction or move towards whatever cause it is that they were keen to see sort of advanced before that. And that's, that's quite natural. And you can see, I think, those who want to invest are very much talking about the stimulus package. I think those who are keen to ensure that we sort of look at one of the, I think probably most people would accept one of the major issues we face, which is climate change, want to see that stimulus package directed at those investments. I think if you've got a regulator that's very keen on sort of advancing a social agenda to ensure that vulnerable customers, however defined, are properly sort of served by the regulated companies in those sectors, I think they might see, again, this is an opportunity to use COVID to sort of advance what they were previously thinking about. And so I don't know if it's an opportunity or a threat, but you get my point.
Jennifer, what were your reflections on that question?
I don't know if it's my natural optimism coming through, Gordon, but I do believe that this could be regarded quite strongly as an opportunity. And just going back to some of Claire's comments that she left us with at the end of her opening remarks, that I think there is an opportunity here to be transformational in the approach that is taken to the response to this. That being said, there will always, as a result of any
I lost your audio. Jennifer? I don't know if others can hear Jennifer. No. Claire, maybe while Jennifer's audio is returning, I can come to you just for your reflections on the point.
Sure, happy to do so. Remarkably, this is one of my few glass half full days, so I agree with you. We're going to see an opportunity here. COVID has affected everyone globally. No one is immune to it, and there's an increased sense of awareness that just wasn't there before. You can see it on a local basis in terms of communities springing up, helping one another, looking out for one another. There was never that degree of empathy prevalent in the sector before. People are genuinely worried about one another before, and I think there is a recognition that everyone has a part to play in making life better going forward. I mean, you can see it locally in Edinburgh with some of the decisions that the council has taken, where they've closed off a variety of roads to allow bikes and pedestrians to roam more freely around the city. That's on a local level, but on a kind of UK government level, you could see if they are willing to take some brave decisions, we could achieve a huge amount. And I guess the ask of UK government and Scottish government is that they take those brave pills, because they've made some huge leaps as a consequence of COVID. They were forced into it to take some fairly drastic decisions to try and safeguard safety. I don't see any reason why they couldn't build on that to try and then start the kick-starting of a green recovery too.
Yeah, and I think that the point that Jennifer was making earlier on, which I think is really important, strikes me as really important, is the collaborative approach, which is breaking out despite ourselves and our tendencies to work in silos, and the fact that people are prepared to form new types of relationship in problem solving. Nick, I saw you nod. Maybe you were can I agree with what I was saying? If you agree, there's that sort of dynamic now, which may not survive the crisis, but we've sort of seen breaking out, that sort of crossing the aisle approach.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're all in favour of collaboration, and I think I certainly agree. I think in all our own, our own personal experience of the pandemic and the way it's affected us as individuals and our families and our friends, I think it has sort of reminded us there is a bit more to life than, I mean, perhaps, particularly to the professional classes who, devote themselves to a career terribly hard, spend a disproportionate amount of time away from home, and they've sort of perhaps pulled people up a little bit. And I think there's no bad thing in that. I think we need to be a little bit careful about making too many sort of assumptions about what you can infer from that for the way in which the world will work. Assuming, and none of us know, but assuming that we do see this sort of, the continued retreat of the virus, and the sort of, the potential within a matter of months for us to return to something like, the normal sort of set of freedoms that we might expect, albeit with a few adaptations around the side. So I just, I do recognise that that impact. But I just think let's just be a bit cautious about what that means, because lots of institutions and individuals are, as I would say, this is a sort of originally a trained economist, are motivated by their own interests. And I think it's really important, I think, to make sure that the public policy goes with the flow of that, acknowledges that, rather than sort of exhorts people to do what they don't see as in their interests, which can just, lead to a lot of wasted time.
I wonder if I can move on to that. And Jennifer, sorry, it looks like your microphone at least is back. Are you there? Perhaps not. Anyway, maybe I can move on to another question, which is, I think, just as challenging, which is, if we look at the scale of the economic damage, and we've kind of touched on it in terms of post-World War II scale retrenchment and impact on economic activity. What the appropriate response to that is in the face of, on the part of the regulators, and an enormous amount of damage being done and will continue to be done to the economy. And when one looks at not just the response that's already taken place, but the responses that will continue to have to be made to that, where does regulation fit within that much bigger public policy, economic agenda, macroeconomic agenda? Again, maybe Nick, I'll come back to you in the first instance.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. I think, we've already, Claire already touched on it, with the sort of, what goes into the stimulus package, because I think we're probably all expecting the need for the economy to get a bit of a boost. And I think there's some all important questions there. I'm instinctivly nervous about, centrally sort of defined, priorities on, what big projects should be built. Frankly, my experience in water is that, on the big things, they command quite a lot of public attention and political interest. And I think probably, you know, the decisions that are made on those big projects are probably about right. They come along at about the right time. The issue is the sort of, you have to look into the detail, scratch beneath the surface to see, you know, the issue in water is actually the poorly understood consequences of sort of micro underinvestment. You know, I mean, for 30 years, we've had a very, very strong incentive on water companies to minimize how much they spend on maintaining their assets. Now, that doesn't really show up for so long as they can muddle through. It won't be a sort of a something that the government will naturally sort of be aware of or champion. And it's that sort of thing. I think if you can tweak the incentives in the right direction, then I think you can deal with that. Generally, I mean, I don't know. I think, the regulators hopefully are pushing broadly in the same direction as the economy in general here, because with interest rates likely to stay low for a long time, this is the moment to renew a lot of our infrastructure. But let's not do it with crude big projects that ministers enjoy taking credit for, but actually won't really move the dial on the priorities that we care most about.
And perhaps Claire, in terms of big projects, infrastructure, pouring concrete, hopefully not. In terms of things like the planning regime, the consenting regime, is now the opportunity, or is now the scope for those sorts of barriers to investment. Tempted to say call them barriers rather than important public policy protections, but those barriers to be swept aside or to be rethought.
Absolutely. I worry about the historic NIMBYism that has gone on. Onshore wind's a good example of that. The withdrawal of the CFD a number of years ago meant that investment in onshore wind went off a cliff edge. The number of projects coming forward went off a cliff edge. Obviously, the government has made an announcement earlier this year to bring onshore wind back to the table. But the concern I have about that is, will it actually take off without a sympathetic planning regime? Because with tip heights changing, the turbines of today are far bigger than they were when they were installed 15, 20 years ago. We actually need regulators to see that actually onshore wind is one of the lowest cost technologies out there. If you combine that with battery storage, you can deal with issues regarding intermittency. So there needs to be, we've talked about collaboration on a number of occasions this morning, but I think collaboration with the private sector is key. And actually, harking back to the discussion that you had last week on the Workcast webinar, where the lady from the Northern Ireland regulator or Irish regulator was talking about the change in tone, the fact that key decision makers from public and private sector were for the first time ever having a dialogue and a discussion. And I think, when I look at the developers in the UK market who have continued to drive forward with plans to build out projects and further build confidence in the sector, we need the regulators and government to come to the table with an equivalent mindset to try and help collaboratively to drive that forward. I guess, there's little argument against a sustainable, clean, secure and fair future, and regulation needs to support that. And I guess if you look at the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, they could act as the benchmark for regulators. If they have those SDGs underpinning decision-making, that could be quite a good guide for them in terms of what really needs to happen and how you prioritise decision-making.
Mm-hmm. I suppose one of the challenges, come back to the institutional setup, is the way that we've divided up regulatory responsibilities, policy responsibilities between different actors. We've got elected politicians playing a very important role, obviously, and appointed technocrats doing other roles. And clearly, when one looks at those sorts of overarching objectives, how effective our institutional architecture is to join everyone together, as opposed to quite deliberately keeping certain things separate.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I've observed over the years, there's definitely short-termism in the political sense in terms of the decisions that have been made. They will go for the vote winners rather than what is right and what is needed, which maybe sounds a little bit harsh, but I've seen it play out when speaking to local authorities about procuring energy supply and making the bold suggestion that in Scotland 32 local authorities could perhaps collaborate and source their energy together with a view to trying to generate a market that could be financeable. And it was like, well, no, we can't do that because we can't do term per purchase contracts. That's the kind of attitude that we need to get.
I wonder if Jennifer is back on the audio.
I'm hoping I am back on the line. Gordon, can you hear me? Yeah, very good. Well, we've been talking about collaboration a few times this morning. I have to say my technology is not collaborating with me today. But there's a couple of things I think from that really interesting discussion that we've just had that I'd just like to pick up on. So, Claire, for instance, you referred to policymakers having regard for the SDGs in policy development, and I think that is fundamental. I mentioned in some of my opening remarks that in part we've seen a bit of a demand-led exchange between investors and investee companies, and I think that is also mirrored in looking at the SDGs between investors and policymakers. So investors are increasingly setting their investment strategies with respect for what that delivers in terms of SDG aligned outcomes. I think that the missing piece at the moment is how that alignment with the SDGs plays out with policy making. And I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head with something that I feel very strongly about, which is the cyclical and short-term nature of political decision making, potentially resulting in suboptimal outcomes. I think we see that play out in investment opportunities and the financing solutions which are out there. So I think that is key. And going back to a little bit further to something that Nick referenced in his comments, interest rates are at an all-time low. The market is not pricing in any increase to interest rates in the UK until 2025. We're at the most protracted period of suppressed borrowing costs in history, and the opportunity therefore is ripe for the taking when it comes to projects, whether they be of large scale or whether they're scaled up and done in a decentralized manner. I think we've been talking about, for example, on and offshore wind projects, and the decentralization along with the decarbonisation of the energy system is a trend that I believe will continue. So I think that with the backdrop of the financing environment that's out there is the discussion that really needs to come to the fore with policy making.
Absolutely. I think the thing I'd like to move on to now, actually, perhaps it's the final question we'll have a chance to talk about. And incidentally, thanks to colleagues who are chipping in questions on the chat box. I'm trying to weave in some of those themes to the questions. Goes back to something that that Nick mentioned at the top of the show, so to speak, in relation to how we value things as a society and the changing perception, perhaps, of what value is and what we value most as a society. And I guess I wanted to ask to what extent, not so much just how COVID-19 has contributed to a change in the public view, public perception of risk and cost and value and return, but perhaps more importantly than that, what needs to be done to recognise and respond to that change of perception. We sit in a sort of a rarefied bubble of in a sense, discussion about regulation and policy, but there's a public conversation that needs to happen. Perhaps it's already started to happen around around risk or value, resilience, all those sorts of things. My question, I think, is how does that public conversation take place? How do we best get that public dialogue going, so that it's not simply, as I mentioned at the very first slide, a conversation amongst a group of regulators, for example, or a group of politicians. So Nick, maybe back to you for that very easy question.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, because I think that, I mean, the thing that sort of dogged the water industry for the last sort of 10 years has been this question of legitimacy, where lots of people have said, well, hold on, it's not legitimate for water companies to sort of pay out large dividends after gearing up. The executive pay is too high. And, we don't really think this is a way to run this really important national infrastructure. And those voices have got a point, quite frankly. And the returns have been high. They've been, my analysis of it is they've been, as I shared earlier, they've been driven by these really powerful economic incentives. And so I think, my solution, and it's not, not a very complicated one, is to just tone down the rewards that come from, if you like, minimizing costs, for example. And you can do that by changing the sort of the cost sharing factors. And I wanted to pick that point up because it came up on the chat. But I think, no, that what you find time and again good thing the regulatory regime did is make us talk to our customers. And what you found time and again is that the customers want a safe, reliable water and wastewater system, not just for now, but in the long term. And this is a really long term sort of industry. It's going to be around for centuries. And all that's needed really is to sort of listen to that abiding requirement and then do a good job on the back of it. And, I don't think there's a need for masses of conversation. It's about making sure that everything points in that direction.
Yeah. I was struck by recalling one of the remarks that one of our speakers, Ed Dodman from Ombudsman Services, made last week, which was about changing the nature of the conversation from one originally before the crisis, when there was a lot of, frankly, bashing behaviour going on in relation to public utilities, and moving onto a different place altogether. And legitimacy, of course, is a great touchstone for that. Jennifer, what are your thoughts?
I think I agree with a lot of what Nick said, and just thinking back to Nick, some of your earlier comments around the fact that this pandemic has really thrown into sharp relief the distinction between essential versus non-essential, and I have to say that was a well-delivered message at 8:50 this morning, to hear that we are not particularly essential. I think that's a message which I think we should recognise. That there is an incumbency on policymakers and regulators to understand the mechanics of economic activity insofar as it's been affected by this pandemic and the spanners in the works that have been thrown as a result of that. So when it comes to responding to that, I do think that is a wider conversation. I agree that that's been quite narrow in the past and probably bordering on exclusionary, if I could use that semi-loaded phrase. So I think in terms of responding to the future and how we look ahead, that really is a question of resilience. How do we engage with stakeholders that do have a significant part to play in shaping what that future looks like, and how are those stakeholders appropriately engaged through that process and through the development of a sustainable platform to build on? That's probably a bit too big a question for us to tackle in totality today, but I think it's a discussion that has to be had. Yeah,
I think that's absolutely right. Claire, can I come to you for some remarks?
Very briefly, I think you were talking about how COVID has contributed to a change in the public view of regulatory risk, and I think it's undoubtable that people have had no choice recently in the last few months to wake up to what's going on in the world. There's been a pandemic ongoing, which has taken many before their time. The resultant catastrophic impact on the global economy, which is actually yet to fully play out. A climate emergency, which threatens even greater destruction, and that's before we even get to the end of this year with Brexit. People are scared, I think, and they're looking for comfort, and that comfort can come to a degree from regulators who can provide the protections, the stability, the framework within which things can move forward to help protect, but also with a renewed focus on building a greener economy, which creates jobs, which we have to create. We have to do that, and a more secure and sustainable future. And going back to the SDGs, I think those will help enormously in helping that framework, because if you look at those, they're centered around security for food, heat, eradicating homelessness, making sure there's security of supply. So all the important things that affect everyone in their everyday lives.
Great. I think that's a very positive message on which to bring things to a close. We're now at the witching hour, so it only really remains for me to thank very, very much Nick, Jennifer and Claire for your contributions this morning. I hope you found it as stimulating as I have, and thanks also to colleagues who've been chipping in thoughts from the sidelines. We've hopefully answered some of the points that you've thrown in. With that, I will thank everyone again and bid you good morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon.